Okay, so if you've been either living under a rock or you have a healthy social life, you might not have noticed that tRPC has released a new version in mid-September called tRPC v10. And while some things about tRPC v10 are good, some are not as good, and let's take a look at that together in this first look at tRPC v10, and let's jump right in. So this is a brand new T3 project, and the first thing that I've noticed in the new version is that it feels slightly opinionated. And why is that? So normally when I use Prettier, which is a VS Code extension, I don't like to have these semicolons at the end, and they kind of force you to have them because they added a Prettier config in the new v10 of tRPC or the T3 stack, which I don't like. It just feels a bit opinionated. So the first thing I usually do is just move this to the bin to get the Prettier working. I don't know, it's like a small thing, but I feel like it's really unnecessary and it kind of just bloats the project. Okay, now we get to the important stuff though. So if you look on the tRPC website, there's a summary of changes they've done, and there are some minor ones like initializing the server. So if we go to server and then under tRPC, we can go to tRPC, and as you can see, the initialization looks a bit different. For example, what is this public procedure? We didn't have that before, and I'm gonna get to that in a second. But mostly this stuff is not that important. I think the most important changes they've made is the middleware and then the procedures. So let's just focus on them right now. For example, here defining routers looks just a bit different. So before, I'm gonna zoom in a bit, we had the router.query, right? And now we have a public procedure.input.query. So what does that mean? Okay, if we go into here, the public procedure, we can use that inside of our routers. So let me close all this stuff. Close that as well. Now we want to create our router to actually handle something in the backend. How do we go about that? So we have the router and the example and the app router that combines all the routers. Now you remember before we had to merge the routers. I'm not sure if they mentioned it somewhere here, but essentially we had the router and then we did .merge for every subrouter we had. And now it's this kind of object style notation. So it's a bit different. And honestly, I'm not really sure why they did it, but that's the new way. And also what I don't really enjoy about the new tRPC is that instead of having the method as quotes, so before, if I comment that out, we had like something export const example router is equal to router, something like that. And then we had .query. We would call the query something like get user, and then pass a object as the second parameter. And then here we would have the input and the resolve function. Now that is the old way of doing things though. That's not how we do it anymore. I'm not too sure why, but now instead of having the quotes, these ones right here where we could use like dashes and something, we have this object style notation. So this right here essentially is this right here in the new tRPC. So we can remove that. And for example, if we wanted to call it get user now, we can't really have the dash, and I don't know why they did it, honestly. So now it should be get user, and I think you can still use quotes, but then the calling on the front end will be a bit different. So let's check it out actually. So we have the get user as quotes, and now we have the get user right here. Okay, so it still works, but you have to put it in this array and then have the string right here, which looks a bit worse than the other approach. So instead of that, we can also have .get all, and that just looks a bit cleaner here. But then again, it doesn't allow us to use something like lowercase and dashes, but forces us to use this kind of casing, which I'm not a fan of, to be honest. Okay, but let's get to the important part and take a look at the procedures. So let's have a test. It's going to be a public procedure. And let's see what this procedure has. So it has a input, meta. We don't really care about all that, but it has a mutation. It has a query. So the two things we had before, but it also has a subscription, which I assume is for something like WebSockets or something. It also has a use. We're going to get to that in a second. That is meant for middleware, which has been greatly improved in the new tRPC version. But for now, we can have something like a query, and that query is going to be a function. And now we can handle everything we want inside of this query. And we get access to the context and the input as the first parameter, context and input. Now we didn't define any input here. Let's take a look at how you would do that in the new one. So you would chain it before the query. So before dot query, we could have dot input. And for example, we could want a, what are they using in the example? Just a z.string. So z.string. So we are expecting a string whenever we call this query, and then we get access to that input right here. So just like before, we can destructure the input, and then we get, we can call it whatever we want if we gave it a name right here. So z.object, and then inside that object we have an object and a value of test string, which is going to be a z.string. And that means we can now destructure the test string from the input and have access to it in the resolve function. So we don't have the resolve anymore, like here, but instead we just chain it to the public procedure, like so. And that is essentially the difference in the v10 router. Looks a bit weird, but I think it's just a minor syntax change that you need to get used to. That's pretty much it. Now, one major improvement that I think they did is in the middleware. So let's take a look at what the middleware looked like before. You can see it right here. So for each route you had, or for each router, should I say, you could declare a middleware, and that middleware would do whatever you want. And then when you're done, you would return next and go on with your query or mutation. Now that looks a bit different in the tRPC v10. So instead of declaring it on the router, we can declare it in this file right here. So let's have a constant of private procedure, which is equal to a t.procedure, and we'll get to the use in a second. Now, what do we want this private procedure to do? Well, if the user is authenticated, then they could be able to use whatever is behind this router. If the user is not authenticated, then they are not allowed to access whatever is behind this router. So in order to check if the user is authenticated, we are gonna write a custom middleware. And they provide an example right here. So let's export a const of user is auth and call it a t.middleware. Now this middleware receives a callback function, which we can destructure some stuff from. For example, the context and the, I think it's the, no, it's next and context, not the input. So next and context, and that will return a function. And in this function, we can pretty much do whatever we want. So let's say if false, or actually let's declare user, const user session is undefined. Just pretend this is an actual user session that we get from something like a next auth. I'm just gonna declare it as undefined. And if there is no user session, then we can, for example, throw a new tRPC error. That error is gonna be like, it's gonna be like unauthorized with a message of you're not authorized to access this resource. Now, if there is a user session, then we're gonna return next. And by doing that, it's pretty much like any Express middleware, if you've ever worked with that, or the inbuilt Next.js middleware. It's pretty similar. Whenever you're done checking whatever you want, you return the next. Or if you don't want the user to proceed, then you can throw an error, and that will essentially prevent the next from being returned. So let's get to use in using this procedure. So let's have the private procedure and use that in our router. So let's say, let's define an action that the user should only be able to do when they're authorized. So post image, for example, if you had a, you know, social media application and the user is only allowed to post images if they are authorized or authenticated, then we're going to have this private procedure pasted there. And now that private procedure is not being imported, now it is dot. And as you can see, it has the same exact methods as the public procedure. It has the input, meta, mutation, query, subscription, use, whatever. Because actually we haven't defined the middleware yet, we still need to do that. Right now it would be the exact same as the public procedure, but if we say use and then user is auth as the middleware we want to use, then this would always check whatever is in here before going to the actual router and executing whatever is behind the router. So we can have dot, and it's still going to be the exact same stuff, but now if we go for like the query, it's going to be past a callback. We can put it like that, and let's just return hello from this query. And let's call it from the front end. So we can destructure the data later, and let's have tRPC dot. And now there's a small difference. Instead of doing like tRPC dot use mutation or use query as before, now we are actually accessing the router. So in this case, it's the example router that we have merged in the app. So it's example. If I were to change this to my router, then as you could see, the example is gone and we would have my router. So it's the value that is right here, whatever we called the router behind it. And now if we use a dot, we can see whatever is available on that router. So in this case, it's either test or it is post image. And we want to post an image, and GitHub Copilot can be annoying sometimes. So post image and dot, Jesus Christ, dot, and then use query. Okay, so we would query something, we could destructure something like the data, error, whatever. You're probably used to that. That's not a change from the v9. And now if we were to execute this, we're still having an error somewhere. So let me just delete some of the standard T3 stuff. Oops. Okay, now that we deleted that, we can save the document and we can, is the server on? We can start the server, go to our localhost 3000. And now let's look into the console and see what happened. So as you can see, we have an error on the GET request. And the error is tRPC client error. You are not authorized to access this resource. Great, because the user was not able to be verified in our middleware that we used for this private procedure. Remember, because this is a, oops, I think I closed it. This is a private procedure we're using, which we defined ourselves. And in order for this query to be able to run, this middleware needs to return next. However, because the user is undefined, this if statement is true, and therefore it returns a tRPC error saying you're not authorized to access this resource. And by using the middleware like this, instead of how we handled it before in the v9 of tRPC, where we did it on the router, instead of on the actual method we're using, like here, we're able to reuse middleware in a very efficient manner. Now, this is one approach, using middleware to authorize. You could also do this just in a router, in any router, like here directly, because you get access to the context. So, for example, you could add the user to the context right here. So const user is undefined, let's say, but in reality, you would use something like a get server-side session, for example, if you were to use nextauth, and then pass the user. So we're going to return the user from here, and that will implement the user in our context. So we will have access to it everywhere. And now we can destructure the user from the context in our routers. And now we can verify the user here without using middleware, right? So if this was a public procedure, we can say if there is no user, then we're gonna throw a new tRPC error that says unauthorized, you're not authorized to access this resource. And that would essentially accomplish the exact same thing. So let me reload the page. As you can see, the requests are failing with a tRPC error that we're gonna get here in a second. You're not authorized to access this resource. Now, so these things, the middleware and checking in the router directly, essentially accomplish the same thing, but by having one procedure defined right here, always using the same middleware, we can save us a bit of maintaining work and also writing work by just having the private procedure whenever we want to handle something protected. Now, one final small little detail I noticed about the new version of tRPC is that if you look at this, right, how would you go about using the on success? Because if you remember, when we were using the old tRPC, we had something like data is equal to tRPC dot use query. We would pass that query a string array called or query. And then right here as the second parameter, we could pass our on success, get the data inside of it as the first argument, and then handle the success or error or whatever, however we want it. With the new version of tRPC, that's not as intuitive because they removed the on success, on error, etc. from the query. So if you pass an object right here, press Control Spacebar to see which properties you get access to, you see they're not in here. You can't have the on success, you can't have the on error. It doesn't really work. I don't think that's the right thing here. Yeah, no, that's totally not the right thing. So you don't get the on success and on error that you were expecting from tRPC v9, right? Whereas if you're using the use mutation, so let's change this to a mutation and change this to a use mutation. In here, if we insert the object and press Control Spacebar, we do get the methods like on error, on settled, on success. So to me, it seems like they removed it from the query, but left it from the use mutation, which I find very odd. But you can just handle the on success as you did before, receive the data as the first argument. So whatever the router returns, in this case, that would be hello. We can log out the data and mutate this use effect, mutate this whenever this first renders. So let's just say mutate, remove the dependencies, and now it will log out hello in the console. So, oops, why is that not working? Okay, so we still have the private procedure. We need to change this to a public procedure. We don't really care about that. Now let's reload the page. And as you can see in the console, it logs out hello. So the on success works just as expected in the tRPC v10, but we can't use it with the on query, which I find a bit odd. Now there are some minor changes I think that are new. I'm not quite sure, but I've never seen the mutate async, for example, before. I think that is new in tRPC v10. So what that allows you to do is handle errors client side pretty much. So you could have a const do something which is async, and then in here we can console log, for example, 1. Then we're gonna mutate async, and then console log 2. And on the on success, we're gonna console log done with mutation. So just to demonstrate to you what happens. And we also want to call this do something instead of a use effect. Do something and only do it when this component first renders. So let's see what happens. Let's restart the page. So we get 1, 2, 1, 2 done with mutation. So as you can see, the mutation is done asynchronously, just as the claim here might suggest. However, we can also await the mutation, essentially having a 1 done with mutation, 2. And so whenever this fails for some reason, for example, let's have the private procedure in here. Whenever this fails, we should get an breaking error right here. So normally when we have a tRPC error, it wouldn't break our application, but now it did, because we're awaiting something that is not in a try-catch block, and it failed. So the solution to client-side handle this would be to wrap this in a try-catch block, and essentially that would allow us to handle error custom, like to handle the error however you want. And now it would just log out handle error custom, so however you want to go about handling the error. I'm not quite sure about why they implemented this, but they did. And yeah, so that is just another new possibility that you have. At least I think it's new. I didn't check. And with that said, that was my first look into the new tRPC v10. I hope you enjoyed exploring this new version with me. I hope you enjoyed the video, learned something new, and then see you in the next video. Have a good one. Bye bye.